Hi, everybody. It's Thursday, and what a Thursday it is. I've been just taking a small nap between class and this recap to start to catch up on the sleep I'm going to miss tonight because Candela Obscura's second chapter will close with a 6.5 hour episode tonight. Whew. Uh, Fittingly enough, we've been talking about actual play in class today because we've been asking our tabletop role playing games a very important question, which is, does your game have an actual play and should it be performed? We have a lot of solo journaling games adopted by students in this class, so this becomes an actually particularly interesting question. Thousand Year Old Vampire actually is on Twitch a lot more than you'd think. So we started off because I arrived to class early, as many of my students do, with me pulling up different links. And in fact, as it turns out, when we were pulling up Twitch and looking up Dungeons and Dragons or tabletop role playing games, we found an enormous number of shows at 2 o'clock Central in the United States, broadcasting in a variety of languages because, of course, it is evening in Europe at that time. And so we got to take a look at kind of actual plays in Czech and Spanish and French and German and a heck of a lot more, which was really, really cool. Right at the start of class, one student said, "Hey, I found this 10 candles stream that's starting in the next 30 seconds." And so, in fact, we had that running silently as a way to start our discussion. It's actually really handy for it to not be in English when you're talking about actual play. One, to gesture to the fact that actual play has a worldwide impact at this point. Dozens of shows were simultaneous in the middle of the afternoon, definitely playing in European evening. Is a really good example of the spread of the phenomenon. But also, it meant that we couldn't get distracted by what was actually happening on screen as we were kind of talking about the layout of a visual, like born video live streamed actual play. In this case, a Spanish version of 10 Candles. It was a really beautiful layout, very much inspired with the multi camera style that we see in a lot of actual plays in that Twitch-based tradition. And so we took use this as a way to kind of look at what viewers are looking at when they're logging onto Twitch. And it's important to note a significant number of students were not familiar with Twitch before we were taking a look today. So it was really important to look at, okay, so there's a Twitch chat. That chat is not just text, but also emotes. Also, subscriptions are a signifier. And actually, in the case of this particular live stream, you could see like a cool little animation pop up every time somebody was resubscribing or subscribing for the first time because a hype train was building. So we were able to look at a lot of the different moving parts and note the ways in which live actual play in its original form, as we know from the last 8 years of the form, a near decade, is not just a passive experience on the part of the viewer. They may be talking to one another in chat. Sometimes the players may also be able to see that chat and respond. And of course, when stuff is pre recorded, players can enter that chat and look alongside them. We talked about the overlay, and the different elements of the overlay. And that allowed me to transition and kind of switch tabs from the live Twitch tab to tabs I had already pulled up before class. And I should note, I made sure all of these tabs were muted so that I could keep them running and have them available as something that we were looking at and analyzing and discussing without kind of getting lost. So I switched us over to one of the earliest Critical Role streams, episode 27, for those of you who are curious, of the first campaign. That allowed us to look at the kind of layout of Critical Role's very early version of its design, which it continues to have in a much more sophisticated and streamlined form to this day. But a lot of the same elements that we were seeing in this Spanish language 10 Candles one shot were also present 8 years ago in that early broadcast. We noted the ways in which much more of the kind of audience activity was included in the overlay than it is now, both in the 10 Candles overlay that we were taking a look at, but also in Critical Role's most recent form. You couldn't possibly have a little animation go off every time someone resubscribed to Critical Role, or the whole show would just become kind of a ping pong of casino-like sounds or animations. So that's been removed. Character art has been moved to a different location. We've moved from pen and ink, kind of pieces of paper being moved around on a large graph kind of sheet to very much more sophisticated layouts of battle maps. So we spent that initial time basically like getting accustomed to Twitch, taking a look at Critical Role as a kind of this is one of the foundational kind of origins of that layout, talking about what that kind of multi camera, you can see everyone all the time format gives you, because there's a reason why Critical Role tonight, when for Candela Obscura, will use the exact same overlay, at least in basic principle, which is to say that you as a viewer can watch whoever you want because they're all the camera is going to be trained on all of them and presenting all of them. The downside is you get to choose. You have to take responsibility. Your eye is not going to be guided in any way about what's important to look at aside from if there's a battle map or something else, in terms of the rotation. And so we talked about this as a really challenging performance style, particularly live, because actual play has you not only as the player performer, but also very much it's unscripted, it's improvisational, which means that you are the author in that sense. And these are the things that are very intuitive to students. It's very clear very quickly what an unscripted show demands of its performers in that way. The multi-camera setup that we were taking a look at also reveals another important aspect that you have to kind of state, but becomes very aha very quickly, which is, as Jen Kretschmer has been known to say to me, it's really hard to perform in that way for hours on end because you are also, on top of those dual roles, playing the role of the audience surrogate. You have to react and pay attention. You cannot have your mind wander. You cannot be looking at your phone. You can go to the bathroom as a general rule, but you're expected that if you are on camera, you are paying attention and giving something to the scene, even if it's not a scene in which you are actively participating at the time. And that's really challenging. And many people that I've talked to who've been involved with casting actual plays talk about it as actually one of the most important performance things that they keep an eye out for as they're building table chemistry. So we talked about these things because it's easiest to talk about actual play in its visual form. But as I repeatedly gestured to throughout class, this is also a format that's highly likely to be heard only in the ears. And we'd already spent some time this week talking, of course, about podcasts and the very weird definitions of that. So the idea that born video content often is also only consumed with your ears, and that there's a whole different tradition that's operating exclusively audio only, is an important thing to gesture to. It's an important thing to remember. But for the purposes of being in a classroom, visual aids are really handy. We will, of course, also have a lot more time to talk about specifically what born audio uh, actual play does and has to do when Taylor Moore comes to talk to us in a little while. So we're also helped out in that way. So the other thing that we found ourselves talking a lot about is this question of audience expectation and shifting audiences. As I record this and talk to you, this is the month that Encounter Party and Faster Purple Worm Kill Kill debut on Dungeons and Dragons' new Fast channel, which is basically free ad supported television, is what fast means for those of you who are curious. So the idea is that we've got two new forms of actual play produced for television that are coming across our screens very soon. Both clock in at precisely an hour with commercial breaks, very different in their own forms. One is a long form storytelling structure that is trying very insistently to avoid parasociality. That's the encounter party pitch. What if an actual play was shot like MasterChef? And what if you cared most about the story and not necessarily the people behind the players? At least that's what Ned Donovan told my students weeks ago at this point. So the students had already heard a little bit about that, and we're going to take a look at Encounter Party as part of the class. Faster Purple Worm Kill Kill is a series of one shots, single episodes with that are self-contained, fast-paced, and with the same central conceit. A group of nerd famous and TTRPG famous people with crossover appeal into the mainstream, playing Dungeons and Dragons at the lowest possible level against the highest possible challenge monsters. In other words, they're all going to die, but it's gonna be really entertaining. Or so is the principle. I have not seen it. I have screeners in my inbox for Encounter Party, but have not yet taken a look. So we discussed who are these shows for versus the already extant audience for actual play. And the value prop and the goal is very distinct. Actual plays historically have built on one another and tried to woo new audiences only kind of sporadically, mostly to pull them into the form. You've got some kind of attempts like hyper RPGs, Kolak's Council of the Gods, which made the very blatant attempt to lure in new audiences from basically casting a whole bunch of people who had other kind of fandoms attached to them, in the hopes that those fandoms would get a taste of their favorite doing this interesting new thing and that maybe they would keep watching. This is also why there's, Critical Role has these really interesting kind of one shots for Red Nose Day and other kinds of attempts. This is the principle behind Dungeons and Drag Queens, arguably one of the most successful attempts at bringing in a new audience to the existing form of actual play. What the D&D Fast channel is banking on is that they can do something so new and so different that they will find an entirely new audience, far larger than the current audience, even for the biggest shows that currently produce actual play. I don't know if it's gonna be successful. I really don't, because it's not geared towards me. It's geared towards my students. It's geared towards my friends and family who do not already play, kind of consume actual play or possibly even play TTRPGs. And of course, one of the really fascinating things is that these are commercial kind of pitches. They're making no claims for organic kind of creation, but have been, in theory, kind of timed very specifically for the market, arguably thinking about audience in ways that many actual plays don't. Now, whether that audience exists, again, we're about to find out. But this was something that students and I have been discussing. And we've been discussing that with a lot of media objects in and around tabletop, especially because so many kind of, you know, creators would love to create a new emergent audience, for the material. And so it's very interesting to talk to students and be like, "No, no, this is supposed to be for you, so what do you think?" Which is a very fascinating conversation to have, especially because it doesn't prioritize the existing Critters or Dimension 20 fans or the Adventure Zone nerds. Why does Dimension 20 and the Adventure Zone do do they have fan names? I haven't yet encountered a cool name, for either of those, collectives, uh, but there you go. But instead, it meets the students who are totally new to TTRPG where they are. So yeah, there's so much that we didn't get to with today in actual play, but we've kind of come across in osmosis, and that we're also going to discuss on our discussion board posts as we keep moving forward, because students are now going to look around if they haven't already. Basically, the assignments due at the end of tomorrow. So we had this discussion. Students could prepare for the discussion by searching for their their system that they've adopted to see if there's already actual plays, or they could go looking now. And so what they've been asked to do is basically send me some links of things that they think were particularly interesting, examples of their particular game. Or if they've totally come up with nothing, one, that's really useful. It's kind of, I pointed to at the end of class today the ways in which discoverability is a really hard problem for much of actual play. If you're not on something like an entire dedicated television channel, or kind of thrust into the public eye in other kinds of ways through media coverage or that sort of thing, discoverability on Twitch is really hard. Discoverability on YouTube is just as challenging. And we talked about the ways in which fan information labor, which is a term coined by Ludi Price, helps with discoverability, if you can manage to have fans excitedly clipping and sharing moments from your show on social media, or if you're doing the labor to facilitate that or yourself, rather than waiting for it to happen organically. Fan information labor also includes things like wikis or explainers. It's not like fan art, because fan art is fan art, but fan information labor, the sharing of recaps and narratives and meta and all of those kinds of organizational things that makes it easier to jump in to a show in the middle of the progress. Oh man, can't put a price on that. Or you can, and it's really expensive. Uh, I wish we'd been able to talk to Danny Carr this semester, the kind of queen of fan information turned professionalized, but maybe someday that will happen. That would be really lovely. Danny Carr, for those of you who do not know, is the lore master at Critical Role, and she now has an assistant because there's quite a bit of lore to wrangle at Critical Role, not just the shows themselves and their animated adaptations, but also the all of the extensions, the prequel graphic novels and other fiction, and an enormous amount more, and probably more to come. Which is all to say that, these we have not even touched on, the ways, and one of the things we didn't get to in class was the blurriness in this space, but it wouldn't, I think, be surprising to students because we've been talking about the blurriness between professional and amateur basically all semester. It's hard to say who's a professional versus who's an amateur, or rather, a lot of people occupy some place in between. We did talk about in between in terms of a phrase that I've coined, the ambitious middle. We didn't just talk about Critical Role, Dimension 20, etc. We talked about, by looking at seriesseeker.com, the kind of one key attempt at increasing discoverability for people who are looking into actual plays. People can put their shows in, provide a bunch of metadata, in other words, information about their show. And then, if you're interested in an actual play, you can search by system and how many episodes and how long are those episodes and what kind of audio. Is it video? What kind of cast is it? What kind of dungeon master? Is it a BIPOC cast? Is it a queer cast? And on and on and on. And the shows that are entering their information into Series Seeker are the ones that I tend to classify as the ambitious middle. They may or may not be completely financially sustainable, but they have artistic ambitions that include being viewed, and that they're actively taking steps in different kinds of ways, including things like putting themselves into search engines in those kinds of ways to be more kind of fully seen. I was having a conversation earlier today on Twitter about why people do actual play and actual play's relationship to home games. And it's an important reminder, as I reminded my students, that many people record actual plays in at least in part because it gives them the accountability to ensure that everyone is meeting. That's not to be underestimated as a kind of energizing principle. And as we can talk about, and I'm sure we will. That can lead to some friction between when you get to folks who want to kind of move a show into that ambitious middle and have aspirations for it and potentially professionalize versus those who for whom it is still primarily play. Uh, and there's a lot more to say about that and the ways in which that works because there's always more to say in tabletop about the different ideas that people come in to both the hobby and the act of creating in the space, be it making games or performing in them or doing other kinds of, work, creative work in the space. People come to it with different goals for what they want out of it, and different capacities both in terms of talent and funding and time and all and resources and uh, positionality and all kinds of things to get wherever it is they want to go. And collectives working together, yeah, can also not always be on the same page. Collectives that manage to exist for any length of time is really amazing, and this is something that I reminded my students. We were looking at a bunch of live D&D performances that were happening on Twitch, each of which had at least a dozen audience members. And I told my students, these are good numbers for Twitch. They're not extraordinary, but they still put them at the highest in, kind of the elite in many ways. To have more people watching you than live, because it is the tip of the iceberg, because hopefully you then have people catch you on the VOD, you move your material to YouTube, and you kind of have a little bit of a long tail after that. It's community theater, but a very different notion of community than we tend to think of it, because community theater in meat space, of course, is regionally localized. Although what's fascinating about teaching this class at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the US means that we do get to see localization because it's localization by language, which I think is really interesting. Coming back at the end to look at that what's live on Twitch also had me remind them of something else. One of the big challenges that I face as a historian of this form. One, most of those streams are not going to be available to take a look at within the next couple of days, weeks, or months. Unless they're moved to YouTube or some other more durable form, those shows are not big enough for Twitch to enable the kind of long-term saving of VODs, video on demand, that you would need in order to research things. Twitch is ultimately designed to be ephemeral, passing. It's, as more than one person has compared it to in my presence, very much like the very oldest forms of television, where Why would anyone save recordings? It's basically just like theater, and you don't record theater necessarily. It wasn't until we got to a big paradigm shift that we started to think, oh, this is also stuff worth saving. And this is the danger for actual play. It is dependent on it is we have very large video files and not insignificantly large audio files that some people have the ability to store for themselves. But of course, a lot are dependent on a variety of platforms. And as we've discovered over the last little while, platforms aren't always reliable. And of course, historians like me also have to think about the ways in which um, self curation happens. So, as if you're watching this, you may be familiar with the fact that Critical Role removed several hundred of its videos, past video content, from its YouTube channel, which is completely understandable. And it's completely understandable in the same way that I think about a woman writer that I studied for much of my early career, the writer Frances Burney. Frances Burney was notoriously self-censoring. She was extremely hard on herself, for one. And so many of her extant letters and journals in the end of her life, she went through and blotted out with ink, cut with scissors, pasted over with additional paper, ruthlessly transformed. We still have those physical objects, and some of my colleagues, including the scholar Hilary Havens at the University of Tennessee, have used various technological, techniques to recover what was written under, what was over inked, um, and thus unearthed what was left behind. Bernie wouldn't like it, but it's incredibly valuable to researchers. Similarly, there are ways to access, at least in some ways, different kinds of video content that's no longer available online if someone thought it was important enough to preserve somewhere else. Alternatively, transcripts often exist for some content that is no longer available online. But again, if there was time and energy that had been put into transcripts or captioning, those are also imperfect. This also makes me think a lot about the Huntington Library, which is the home of the Larpent collection. The Larpents were basically the state censors for theatrical works for much of the 18th century. And a lot of what we know about 18th century main stage theater comes from the fact that they have all of the scripts that were sent to the licensor, the literal examiner of plays, who would then go through the script with pen and ink, striking out anything that was deemed inappropriate for the stage, usually in terms of political content. Those strikeouts were not Bernie's like full ink out obliterate, just crosses out in many cases. And so we can still see what was kind of submitted to the licensor and what they had removed. Thus, we have a record of the kind of original playwright's intention as well as what was most likely performed. That's incredibly valuable. And as I think about another form that is at least highly concentrated in Los Angeles, if not exclusive to there, or even arguably indigenous to Los Angeles, but that's a completely different office hour, guys. But as we think about this, I think about what is the equivalent of the Larpent collection that's going to be preserved for actual play. And this is a question that I asked my students. Is it important that we preserve video content, even though video content is not intangible? It requires hard drives, and archival hard drives have to be replaced every few years. It's not a set it and forget it kind of memory making. Are scripts enough, or is that insufficient? What is the solution? We have to think about this, and we kind of have to think about it fast, especially because we're already know we're going to lose so much because we're losing so much every day because so many really small shows perform on Twitch, are available for a little while on the VOD, and may pass from our ability to take a look at them before we even know they were there. I was talking to some creators who were trying to create kind of clip reels of their past work, and already they are seeing this happen. Actual plays that they remember performing in are no longer available on the internet. And that's really sad and a very real reality. And in some ways, we can think about this in terms of theater history. We would love for there to be some certain milestone performances of great theatrical, moments of the past. But we also accept that theater is inherently ephemeral and that it's not going to be around forever. That we capture the moment, as William Blake says, we kiss the moment as it flies. And if we stay in that theatrical headspace, then yeah, we collect the other evidence that floats around it. The problem is, unlike the Larpent collection, there's no script that survives. There's no revival possible. And so much is lost even in those transcripts, as anyone who's taken a look at crit roll transcript searches on chirogenics has ever found. You have to breathe life back into them, which is why I'm really grateful, for example, that Dimension 20 highly polishes its captions into something that also includes interpretive sound and understandings of the vibe of what's happening at the table, not just the words uttered. And there's more to say about how transcription is itself an editorial and artistic form of interpretation, and one that's incredibly important, not just as a access tool, but again, as a preservation tool, as a way of communicating. I certainly have captions on anytime I'm watching an actual play. And so this is what I sent students out with, which is this notion that history is in the making, even as we are kind of sitting here, in our case, in Auburn, Alabama. This month, we've got two new shows that could indeed change much of what we think of when we think of actual play. Or they might be another experiment that, you know, adds to the snowball, although even if it doesn't change the paradigm. I don't know. This is the thing about living through history and being someone who says, I don't predict, I only report. And we also need to think actively about what we remember. And one of the things that's been very striking to me this year, as I've reinforced to students, is how short memory really is. Consider this. Even for my students who are already familiar with actual play as a form, for them, their memory is only a few years old. For those who are most excited about Fantasy Kai coming back, it's because they were in high school when that show debuted, which means that the older versions of actual play came out when they were in middle school, maybe even elementary school. That's a long time in their frame of reference. For me, all of actual play has come out while I've worked at this institution, and so for me, something like the early days of Acquisitions Incorporated feels like yesterday. But when I talk to new practitioners, and there were, major waves of actual play in 2018 and in 2020 in particular, although there are other little smaller waves along the way, if you came in at those particular high watermarks of the form, you may only have the kind of show that inspired you in turn and not a sense of the further history. This is honestly where I come in, um, because I'm able to kind of have a wider perspective, even though it's a more distant one. I am grateful to those who have given me their kind of boots on the ground experiences and memories, so that we can start to piece together what actual play was, what it is, and hopefully what it's going to be in its future. That's the really exciting thing, and the thing I was hoping to communicate to students today. And so something I hope I communicated to you too. And if there are questions, as always, I'm happy to answer them. or we can call it a day and I can go continue to take a nap before a very long actual play that will end sometime before 4 a.m. my local time. Spencer, why are you like this? um, which is all to say, that you will be able to catch me, in a couple of different places, in the next little while. Tomorrow I am, after the Great Candela Experiment Part 2 concludes, I will be talking to Sam over at Pop Archives, another really awesome YouTube channel if you're not familiar with it. And that I think will be made available later on. But we're going to be talking about archives and how they function in Candela, particularly appropriate given this most recent chapter. And you can catch me live on Twitch at Critical Misses channel for Morning Ritual on Saturday morning. I don't know what we're going to talk about. It'll be something in TTRPG, and it'll probably be a pretty intense roller coaster. I'm looking forward to it, and you might want to catch me there. And early next week, I'll be joining Historians at the Movies podcast for a discussion, also to be kind of distributed later, about with Trevor Valley on Honor Among Thieves, the D&D movie. So I guess I finally have to watch the D&D movie. Yeah. It's a busy time here, and I hope that you are keeping well in a time of great strife. It's worth noting again for the history books, so to speak, or at least for contextualizing when this office hour video was recorded, that we are in a time of great humanitarian struggle. And it is taking its toll, as I think I've mentioned in other videos, on my students, even though we are far from the epicenter of many of these conflicts. And it's important to remember that in addition to this being a difficult time of the year, as it often is in the academic calendar, that there's lots of heavy burdens out there. And uh, it's important to remember, I think, even more insistently, that we can imagine better worlds. And that's what this class hopes to do. So, also, the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment of the Humanities are amazing, and please support them. That is also a call to action that is necessary, apparently, because they are once again being threatened with defunding. Which, fun fact, when not teaching right now, I am applying for not one, not two, but three NEH grants relating to the study of actual play and its people. And as we know, that's a ticking clock. So I would rather be rejected on my own merits rather than because the funding agency no longer has any money. So if you are watching this and live or in the kind of days after, please just Google support NEH, support NEA, and send an email to your representatives or do 5 calls or that sort of thing, just to let them know that if you like this kind of content, you definitely like the things. I think you're definitely interested in the kind of work I'm seeking funding to do, uh, including hopefully more YouTube content in the fullness of time. That's not just me talking into my own mic and my reasonably okay webcam. So, with that part of the lecture complete, I hope you're having as good a time in this rough and broken world as possible. And I will see you next week as we discuss games for children with a special look at the ways that D&D is trying to move itself into K through 12 classrooms and after school programs, and one of my favorite new games to play with my niece and nephews, Quest RPG. Until then, have a great weekend.